The air in the small, dimly lit living room of the old house hung thick with smoke and the faint scent of old wood. The sound of cards shuffling cut through the heavy silence, accompanied by the occasional clink of a bottle being opened and poured. It was the kind of night when everything felt slightly off, but no one dared to voice it. The flickering of the candle flames cast long, wavering shadows against the walls, as if the house itself were alive and watching them. Four friends sat around a worn-out wooden table, their faces partially illuminated by the flickering candlelight. The table was strewn with cards, empty glasses, and ashtrays filled with half-smoked cigarettes. It had started innocently enough, a casual card game to pass the time in this secluded, eerie cabin they had rented for the weekend. The place was nestled deep in the woods, far from the bustling city, a perfect getaway to unwind. Or so they thought. The group had met in college, and, though their paths had diverged over the years, they still made it a point to get together every few months. Tonight was no different, though there was something about this particular evening that felt off. "I'll deal this time," Sarah said, her voice steady but with an edge of something unspoken. She shuffled the deck one last time, her hands moving swiftly, almost too quickly. Then she cut the deck, splitting it neatly into two piles before passing the cards to each of them. John, sitting across from her, leaned back in his chair, looking around the room with a slight frown. He wasn't sure if it was the isolation of the cabin or the way the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally around the walls, but something felt strange. The others seemed oblivious to his unease. Tom was busy lighting another cigarette, while Linda was staring at her cards, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You guys ever feel like we're being watched?" John asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. It was a question he hadn't meant to ask, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. Linda glanced up from her hand, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone light, though there was a trace of concern hidden beneath. "I don't know. Just this feeling that the house is looking at us," John replied, shuffling in his chair uncomfortably. He knew it sounded ridiculous, but there it was, a sensation in his chest that he couldn't ignore. The shadows seemed to sway in time with the movement of his eyes, as if they were alive. Like, the walls are closing in, or something. Sarah laughed, the sound sharp and a little too forced. "You've been watching too many horror movies, man. There's nothing weird about this place. It's just old." She threw him a reassuring smile before turning her attention back to the game. "Anyway, let's play. You're just scared of losing, right?" John opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door. It was the kind of knock that reverberated through the house, shaking the floorboards. They all froze, eyes wide. None of them had expected anyone to come this far out into the woods, especially not in the middle of the night. "Who the hell?" Tom muttered, putting out his cigarette and standing up. "I'll go check," Sarah said, standing as well. She looked around at her friends, her face pale. "It's probably just some local, maybe someone lost." "Yeah, maybe," Linda said, but there was an edge to her voice that suggested she didn't believe it either. Sarah moved cautiously toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate. The others watched in silence, an inexplicable dread growing in their chests. The knock had sounded different, not like a human knock, almost as though something was deliberately trying to get their attention. She reached the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before she hesitated. "Should we even open it?" she asked over her shoulder, her voice shaking. "Go ahead," Tom said, his tone dismissive, though his eyes betrayed his concern. Who else would be out there? Sarah turned the knob, and as the door creaked open, they all held their breath. There was no one standing on the porch. Nothing but darkness stretched out into the trees beyond. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the distance, but it was eerily quiet right on the porch. Sarah stared out into the blackness for a moment before stepping out onto the porch, scanning the shadows with a furrowed brow. There was nothing but the sound of the wind, and the unsettling feeling that something was off. "Nothing," she called back to the others. "It's probably just the wind playing tricks on us." She stepped back inside, shutting the door behind her with a soft click, but as she turned to face the others, she froze. The room was different. The shadows, once merely strange, now seemed to move, to shift. "What's wrong?" John asked, his voice tight with anxiety. His heart was pounding in his chest. "Sarah?" She didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the wall opposite her, her face pale and wide-eyed, her gaze fixed on something that none of them could see. There, etched into the wall, was a symbol, a strange, almost otherworldly marking, as though something had carved it into the surface of the wood while they weren't looking. It was intricate, like a twisted, jagged knot, a pattern of lines and curves that seemed to writhe and pulse with an unnatural energy. I didn't see that before," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Tom's eyes followed hers, narrowing. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his tone suddenly serious. "We should have noticed that earlier." But none of them had noticed it before, and now that it was there, it was impossible to ignore. John stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "It's just a mark. Some kind of graffiti or something. Maybe it was here when we got here." But even as he spoke, he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The air had grown colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow deeper, stretching unnaturally. "I don't like this," Linda said, her voice trembling. She was holding her cards tightly in her hands as though they were a lifeline. "I think we should leave." But Sarah was already moving closer to the wall, her eyes never leaving the symbol. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface. The moment her skin made contact, the room seemed to tremble. The candle flames flickered violently, and the air grew thick, as if the entire house had taken a sharp, collective breath. Then, the walls seemed to groan, the wood creaking in a way it hadn't before. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to Sarah's touch. The symbol pulsed under her fingers, its lines shifting and changing, as though it was drawing itself deeper into the fabric of the wall. "Sarah, get away from it!" John shouted, his voice filled with panic. But it was too late. In an instant, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The entire house seemed to shake, the walls warping and stretching as though they were being bent by an unseen force. A guttural sound, like the moan of some ancient beast, reverberated through the floorboards, and the room plunged into darkness. The darkness was absolute. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with an unearthly silence. Sarah's fingers, still pressed against the wall, twitched as though they had been electrified. Her heart raced in her chest, and the oppressive darkness swallowed every sense she had. The shadows seemed to close in, thick and suffocating. Even the usual sounds of the wind outside had gone completely still, leaving only the sound of their frantic breathing. "Sarah?" Tom's voice trembled in the darkness, but it was barely audible, as if the sound was being swallowed by the very air around them. Suddenly, a low rumble began to emanate from deep within the house, vibrating through the floorboards. The sound was deep, like the growl of a creature far below the earth's surface, reverberating in their bones. It was a sound that seemed unnatural, terrifying in its depth and resonance. And with it, something shifted in the air, something ancient and malevolent. What the hell is happening?" Linda whispered, her voice quivering with fear. John could barely breathe. His lungs felt heavy as though the very oxygen was being stolen from him. The walls seemed to be undulating in time with the vibrations. Every shadow appeared to twist and writhe, stretching across the room in disturbing, unnatural patterns. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. Then, there was a sudden flicker, a burst of light from the candles, casting an eerie glow across the room before they went out completely, plunging them back into darkness. "Guys!" Sarah cried out. Her voice was thick with fear. "What is this? What is happening to us?" John stumbled forward, blindly reaching for her, but his hands met only air. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as though it were shifting, and he fought to steady himself. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel the walls around him press in, the temperature plummeting. It felt as though they were descending, like the house was sinking into something far darker beneath. From the corner of the room, a low whisper began to rise. It was soft at first, barely audible. But then it grew louder. A voice, distorted and twisted with a low, gurgling rasp. The words were indecipherable, the language foreign, like a chant or an incantation that had not been spoken in centuries. "Who is that?" Linda's voice was barely more than a whisper, her breath shaking. "Where is that coming from?" The whispering grew louder, the voice now filled with a deep malice that sent chills racing down their spines. John felt his heart race as the walls began to hum, vibrating as though the house itself were alive, feeding off their fear. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, thick and suffocating. It was a silence that clung to them, pressing against their ears and their minds. "Sarah?" Tom shouted, his voice cracking. "What the hell is going on?" But Sarah didn't answer. The darkness pressed down on them, making it harder to breathe, to think. Every second stretched out, each one feeling like a lifetime. And the air grew colder, sharper, until it felt like they were standing in a tomb. Then, without warning, the house seemed to shift. The walls groaned, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. Something heavy, something immense, was moving beneath them. The feeling of being submerged in water, of being weighed down, overwhelmed their senses. John stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his heart pounding. Then, as though some unseen force had ripped open the air itself, a jagged line of crimson light suddenly split the darkness. It was as if the night itself had been torn open, revealing something ancient and terrible, something that did not belong to this world. In the center of the room, a massive figure materialized. It wasn't fully formed, but it was enough to make their blood run cold. A dark silhouette, made of swirling shadows and tendrils of black smoke, stood in the center of the room. It was enormous, towering over them with an eerie presence. Its form shifted, constantly changing as though it were made of the very darkness itself. But one thing was certain. It was not human. The thing twisted and undulated, tendrils reaching out in every direction like the limbs of some forgotten nightmare. Its eyes, glowing an unnatural red, focused on them with a malevolent hunger. And in that moment, every part of their body screamed at them to run, to escape. But the air was thick with something intangible, like an invisible wall that kept them rooted in place. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "No, no, this isn't real." But her words seemed to fade as the dark figure seemed to grow more solid, more tangible, and as it did, the temperature in the room dropped even further. They could see their breath now, plumes of fog rising from their lips as fear clutched their hearts. The figure did not speak, but its gaze was piercing, its intent clear. It had come for them. The floor beneath them began to tremble violently, as if the earth itself were shaking. A deafening roar filled the room, a noise so low it rattled their teeth, echoing through their skulls. It sounded like the roar of some ancient beast, a creature older than time itself, and it came from all around them. "Run!" Tom screamed. "We have to get out of here." But just as they turned to flee, the door slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang. The windows shattered, sending shards of glass spiraling through the air, and the room was consumed by a freezing wind that howled through the broken panes. The house itself seemed to scream in agony, its very walls shaking under the pressure of whatever malevolent force had found its way inside. The figure in the center of the room moved, its tendrils lashing out like whips, wrapping around them, pulling them back into the center of the room, trapping them with an invisible force. Their bodies were frozen, unable to escape. No matter how hard they struggled, John fought against the dark tendrils, his skin burning where they touched him, but it was useless. It was like fighting against the pull of a black hole, unable to break free. Then, as the room seemed to close in around them, as the darkness began to drown out everything else, the creature spoke. Its voice wasn't human. There was nothing human about it. It was a voice that reverberated inside their skulls, that echoed in the deepest part of their minds. "You should not have come here." The words crawled through their consciousness, freezing their blood, their limbs paralyzed with terror, and then the darkness consumed them completely. The darkness stretched on, unyielding and suffocating. No light reached them, no sound but the pounding of their own hearts. Each of them seemed to lose track of time. their sense of reality warping around them as if they were caught in an endless void. The oppressive weight of the air made it feel as though they were drowning, suffocating, in the blackness that enveloped them. The creature's voice continued to echo in their minds, its words relentless and cold. "You should not have come here. You trespassed, and now you belong to me." The sensation of being pulled deeper into the shadows grew. The walls of the room no longer existed. The floor beneath them was gone. It was as though they were suspended in nothingness, floating in the suffocating abyss of the creature's power. The tendrils of dark smoke wrapped tighter around them, a grip that burned their skin wherever it touched. Sarah felt a jolt of terror. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her lungs were frozen, her body entirely under the creature's control. The walls of her mind were collapsing, and she could feel the last vestiges of her control slipping away. "Guys, where are you?" she thought desperately, but no one replied. There was no comfort, no sense of familiarity. She couldn't even feel her own body anymore. Only the overwhelming presence of the creature pressing in from all sides. Linda's voice broke through the haze, weak but full of dread. "What is this? What's happening?" John tried to respond, but his words faltered. His throat constricted as though something was choking him from the inside. The darkness was taking shape now. The whispers were no longer distant. They were right in their ears, gnawing at their minds. The figure's red eyes burned brighter now, filling the void with an unnatural glow. Sarah could see the creature more clearly, its grotesque, shifting form becoming more tangible. It was a nightmare made flesh, an entity born from something far older than human memory could grasp. Its presence consumed the space around them, folding the very fabric of their reality. Its tendrils curled around Sarah, pulling her toward the center, where a dark void yawned wide, like an infinite pit of despair. She could feel herself slipping toward it, her body weightless, as though she were falling through endless space. "You will become part of the darkness," the creature said. Its voice was a low hiss, like a whisper from the grave. "You will serve the void for eternity."
No.
Sarah gasped, panic filling her chest. "No, I don't want this. We made a mistake. We didn't know. Please." But the creature did not care. Its presence only grew stronger, tightening its grip on them. It was inevitable. They had disturbed something ancient and unknowable, and now they would pay the price. Sarah's mind raced. She had to think. There had to be a way out. But the darkness was consuming her thoughts. Her vision blurred, the edges of her reality fraying. Her limbs felt like they were losing their shape, her body becoming a part of the swirling shadows. John, still frozen, heard Sarah's voice break through the blackness. Her words were fragmented, distant. "You have to fight it." It was all he could think of, fight. He fought to focus, to push past the overwhelming terror. He had to help her, help all of them. There had to be something they could do. They couldn't let this thing win. He refused to let it take them. With a sharp, panicked breath, he wrenched himself from the grip of the tendrils. His body was weak, his limbs shaking with the effort, but the dark force that surrounded them seemed to falter for a brief moment. His vision cleared just enough for him to see the creature's eyes flicker with a moment of surprise. In that instant, his hands found the cards scattered across the floor. The cards that had been part of their game earlier, the ones that had felt so innocuous, so harmless. And yet, now they seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, a flickering light that held a strange power. John didn't know why he was doing it, but he grabbed a handful of the cards, holding them tightly in his palm. His fingers burned as the cards felt unnaturally warm, almost alive. Without thinking, he slammed the cards into the floor, yelling out with every ounce of strength he had left, "Leave us alone. This isn't your world." For a moment, everything went still. The creature stopped moving, its tendrils halting midair. The darkness that had enveloped them all paused, as though the very fabric of reality was holding its breath. Then, a low growl rumbled from the depths of the void. The creature's eyes flickered, and the shadows recoiled, retreating from the cards in his hands. "Foolish mortals," the creature hissed, its voice filled with venom. "You think you can stop me? You think you can defy the void?" John's heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground, refusing to back down. The cards glowed brighter now, their light filling the space around them with a soft, otherworldly radiance. "Tom, Linda, Sarah," John shouted, his voice hoarse. "Grab the cards. Help me." There was no response at first, but then Sarah's voice echoed from the darkness. I can feel it. I can feel the energy. It's working. Grab them." The moment Sarah spoke, something shifted. The creature recoiled, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. The air seemed to hum with an unfamiliar force, a power that felt foreign but powerful. Tom's voice broke through next, stronger now. "I got one. It's glowing." He was holding one of the cards in his trembling hand. "I can feel it. This isn't normal." Linda's voice, too, now rang out in the darkness, full of disbelief and newfound resolve. "I have one. It's burning." As each of them grasped a card, the creature's form began to unravel, its tendrils retracting into the shadows, its red eyes flickering with fury. The house trembled again, the dark force recoiling, as if it were losing its grip on them. "No!" the creature screeched, its voice distorted with rage. "You cannot stop me." But it was too late. The cards, seemingly just pieces of paper before, now pulsed with a bright, blinding light. Together, they formed a barrier, a shield against the creature's power, blocking the darkness from consuming them any further. The light grew, expanding outward, pushing back against the oppressive force of the house and the creature within. The creature's form writhed, its shape collapsing into nothingness, its red eyes flickering one last time before they vanished into the void. The house groaned, its walls rattling as if it were being torn apart, and then silence. The house was silent, its oppressive energy now gone. They stood in the dim light of the early morning, still shaken, but alive. The creature had vanished, its presence nothing but a nightmare now. "We need to go," John said, his voice firm. "We've had enough of this place." Without another word, they hurried out of the cabin, the door creaking open on its own, as if allowing their escape. The air outside was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. They walked through the forest, the shadows of the trees stretching long in the dim light. But as they moved further from the cabin, something didn't feel right. John felt it first, a strange sensation, a lingering weight in his chest. He glanced at the cards still glowing faintly in his hand. They weren't just objects. They were something more, something connected to whatever evil had lingered in that house. As the group walked on, Linda asked, "Are you sure you're okay, John?" He forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just tired." But deep down, he knew, the house had only been the beginning. Something darker, more powerful, still waited in the distance, the wind whispered, carrying a voice they could not hear, but one John could feel deep in his bones. You can never escape. And that voice, that presence, would haunt them for the rest of their lives.